Welcome to Weekend Office Hours with Professor Paul Deneri. My name is Sirish Pulusani, and today, Paul, or rather yesterday, we mark 6 months since Russia launched this invasion of Ukraine. And February 24th is when the invasion actually started. They had likely been prepping for this for a while. Since then, the world has changed, and I'm just going to recap a tiny bit, and then I'm going to let you, the expert, expand on that. So this is from Foreign Policy Magazine. 6 months after the first barrage of airstrikes that launched Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the world has changed. Alliances, worldviews, and energy markets have become tested while Europe has experienced its largest refugee crisis since World War II. And this is the largest crisis in Europe since World War II as well. And, at this 6-month mark, Ukraine celebrates its continued independence after a half a year of war, but it's also bracing for major escalation potentially from Russia. Multiple reasons for that. And one of the things we will talk about is the assassination of the Russian journalist Daria Dugina. But let's first start. 6-month mark. What is your analysis so far?
Big picture, I would say a couple of things. We're very much living in a different world than we were on February 23rd. I think the war, in my mind, to break it down simply, we're now in the third phase of the war. The first phase of the war was this big Russian attack along 4 axes. Really, only one of those axes had much success. So the second phase of the war sort of started in April, May, when they decided to focus on the Donbass. They stopped attacking Kiev with ground troops anyhow, stopped on Kharkiv. They focused on Donbass, made some progress in Donbass, and now that's bogged down as well, largely just because of the attrition of forces. So now we're in this stage where neither side really has enough manpower, we believe, person power, to take a lot of territory from the other or back from the other. And so we're now in a stage that I think most analysts expect to be a very long slog.
Mm-hmm. And just to continue on that, the challenge for Ukraine, this is from a foreign policy analyst, the challenge for Ukraine is the same as it was on day one, keeping the West on the side as the cost of supporting Kiev hit home, not just Putin's gas and grain blackmail, but also the cost of economic and humanitarian support. What is the feeling from the West and the support that Ukraine has been receiving so far? Is that going to continue? I mean, at the level it has been?
I think this is a good question, and I think in the West, this is where you get some. There are different views. I think among most of the foreign policy elite in Europe and in the United States, there's immense consensus. And again, I always say this: Democrats and Republicans in the United States, can't agree on whether the sun comes up in the East or the West. But they agree on Ukraine and they agree on Russia. And that's largely true across Europe. And every time there's some uncertainty about it, Russia does something like they did yesterday, which is bomb a train station full of civilians. Or they basically do these things where they're risking a nuclear power accident that would poison all of Europe, that make the Europeans, if they're wondering about whether they want to continue fighting this, it makes them all say, my God, we've got to stand up to this guy. At the level of the average consumer who doesn't know anything or care anything about Ukraine, I think it's probably a little bit different. I'm guessing, and I've heard some friends of mine in Europe say that people in Europe are sort of asking, why don't we just give Ukraine to the Russians and get on with our lives?
Mm-hmm. And the answer
I think
to that,
people in the States saying that.
Yeah, they are saying that. We've gone over why that's not such a great idea.
Yeah.
But like you said, I mean, they're very reckless, the Russians specifically. And how they're engaging with the enemy. One of the issues was this power plant. Is it the largest nuclear reactor in Ukraine for sure, and one of the largest in Europe?
It's one of the largest, if not the largest in Europe. It has 6 reactors.
It has 6. Okay, and so this nuclear plant in southeast Ukraine, it was taken over by Russian troops, and it has also been partially disconnected from the power grid, which does not bode well. And if you could explain why that's not a good thing.
Yeah, so this gets to my upbringing. My father worked in nuclear power, so I know something about this, and I've studied Chernobyl and all this. Nuclear power plants generate immense amounts of electricity, but of course they're not always up and running, and they need electricity to power the pumps that pump the water that keep the plants cool. So all of the time, right, this nuclear material generates heat. And even when it's sort of not all up and running, it generates some residual heat. And so they're always circulating water through these power plants to keep them cool. And if you stop circulating the water, eventually the water boils, it turns to steam. The steam either just melts away or explodes, and the thing melts down, right? It melts the structure around it because it gets so hot.
That's where the word meltdown comes from.
That's where the word meltdown comes from, yep. And this is what happened in Fukushima. In Fukushima, the problem was the power supply was cut as a result of the sort of the first stage of the tsunami, of the earthquake and tsunami. But they had backup generators. The problem was the tsunami was so high that it went over the containment wall and it flooded the diesel generators that are sort of the emergency backup supply. So in Zaporizhia, there's all this fighting going on, and the Russians have even talked about deliberately cutting the supply of power from Ukraine, where it's always been supplied from, so that they can supply it themselves. But the big point is if the outside power supply gets cut off for just some military reason, and this actually happened earlier today because of a fire somewhere else, power supply got all then you've got between you and a complete disaster is a bunch of diesel-fired generators. Which
and when you say disaster, like what are we talking about here? Like
you're talking about Fukushima, Chernobyl sort of disaster, which are the two biggest nuclear disasters in history.
Okay.
You're talking, I mean, potentially you're talking about a meltdown. There are other risks at that factory as well. There's risks of fires because the Russians have stored a lot of military equipment inside the reactor halls. I think to protect it so it can't really be bombarded because the Ukrainians aren't going to bombard a nuclear power plant. But that means if there's a fire in there, you can't get equipment in. It means if there's explosives in there and there's a fire, stuff starts blowing up. There's also all the spent fuel that's stored around the facility, which if there's fighting nearby, then that stuff can get into the air. So it's a pretty cynical thing to do, basically, to say we're going to take, not only are we going to take over this nuclear power station, but we're going to sort of turn it into a military bunker, and challenge you to try to get us out.
This is what the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Mariano Grossi, said earlier this month, that fighting at the power plant poses a very real risk of a nuclear disaster that could threaten public health and the environment in Ukraine and beyond. This is the largest nuclear reactor in Europe. So what is the best case scenario here? What are the Russians hoping to do? Obviously, I assume they don't want a meltdown to happen. The Ukrainians definitely don't want a meltdown to happen. None of us want a meltdown to happen. What could potentially take place here?
I think the hope is that the war proceeds in a way that that there's no point in fighting at that particular place. So one can imagine, for example, that Ukraine, let's say Ukraine does well, it's able to capture territory that basically cuts those Russian forces off. So that rather than fighting going into around that plant, it just makes sense for the Russians to withdraw. That would be kind of the ideal. Or if the Russians are going to keep it, it would be nice if the battle lines move far enough away so that then the supply of energy to the power plant could be stabilized and maintained.
Okay.
There's a lingering problem in that the Ukrainians have upgraded this, from what I understand. The Ukrainians have upgraded the power plant with all kinds of new technology that the Russians don't have and don't know how to work with. So they're also dependent on these 10 or 12,000 Ukrainian engineers to run the plant. But of course, as Russia takes over and puts their Russian system in play, people are going to want to flee. And so one of the things that they're actually very dependent on is the heroism of these Ukrainian plant operators whose families have fled. They want to flee, but they're basically sticking around saying, whether we like it or not, we've got to keep running this plant because if we don't, something terrible is going to happen.
Are you saying they're sticking around voluntarily as opposed to being held captive there?
I don't think we know. I think there's probably a mix. I think there are some people who are saying, as much as I don't want to be here, this is my duty and I'm going to do it. And I think there are others who would like to leave, and the Russians are probably saying, sorry, but you got to run this plant.
How does this affect energy needs in Europe? And I just want to put this in the context of, one of the greatest challenges is going to be this winter as gas supplies come under strain. And CNN says Russian President Vladimir Putin's leverage over the continent grows. And for now, Europeans are feeling the pain in their wallets. But essentially, the gas supply, I think almost 50% or over 50% of it, or the energy supply, is reliant on Russia. So what's going to happen as those needs become greater during this seasonal change?
Yeah, so to be clear, the electricity produced in Zaporizhia is not being sold in Europe. It's all being consumed in Ukraine.
Okay.
So that doesn't make that worse. I think one of the big uncertainties over the next year of the war is what happens in Europe this winter. That depends in part on Russian tactics, although I think Russian tactics are going to be pretty easy to predict, which is there's not going to be much gas. I think the Russians are probably deciding exactly how miserable they want to make Europe. A lot, of course, will depend on the weather in Europe this winter. If it's a mild winter, that's great. If it's a cold winter, you're going to burn a lot more gas. A fair amount depends on how quickly adjustments can be made. Norway is now pumping more gas. Norway has now replaced Russia as Europe's leading supplier of natural gas. There's sort of crash programs to build the facilities to bring liquefied natural gas from the Middle East and from the United States. So we'll have to see. But I think everybody expects it's going to be a really rough winter. I think after that, things will get better because over time, the capacity to replace Russian gas is being built in.
The seasonal changes, the weather effects have historically played major roles in various conflicts and wars throughout history. The brutal winters are usually on the side of the Russians. They prevented Napoleon's invasion, Hitler's invasion, or at the very least, they prevented that from going further. So is this something that Russia is counting on at this point, like a brutal winter where it can affect the morale of Europe, the morale of Ukraine, and even energy supply needs of those areas?
Yeah, there's this famous old saying that Russia has two great generals, January and February. I think that applies more when somebody from far away is attacking, like Napoleon in 1812 or the Germans in 1941, 42. I'm not prepared for it. The Ukrainians are fighting in their home territory. I think for any soldiers, Ukrainian or Russian, who are out in a trench somewhere, it's going to be cold. I think for that reason, most people think that the war will probably slow down over the winter. And I've read different things. There's the problem of mud come springtime in that part of the world. I've read different things about whether that's a factor that will really stop things up or not. There are a lot more roads and bridges and a lot better roads than there were in 1941 when it really slowed down the Nazis. So I think that's a question. But my expectation is that this war is going to keep on going straight through the winter, even if it changes a little bit.
You've said that from the beginning. I mean, really, this is a long game.
It's a long slog,
and we even had this podcast as the end of the beginning earlier this thing. But really, it's just another stage of this that could draw on for a really long time. Now, that being said, I mean, this was also something that was anticipated by Putin to be almost like a lightning war, capture Kiev, take Ukraine very quickly. And now we are at a 6-month mark where that is not the case. And it has drawn out, and it could draw out for a lot longer. So what is your sense around how Putin is experiencing the 6-month mark?
The last thing I want to do is try to pretend I understand Vladimir Vladimirovich. But now I'm going to try. I think this is not what he expected, but I think he is determined to see it through. I see no signs whatsoever that anybody in the Russian elite is thinking time for plan B or C. I think what's now being said in Moscow is, well, this didn't go the way we wanted to, but we will outlast the Europeans. We will outlast the Ukrainians. We will outlast the Americans. And I think the only real question is what that means. So let me give you two different versions. One version is this war goes on just like it is, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, until the Ukrainians run out of men, the United States gets tired of supplying, or whatever, or the Europeans want cheap gas again and just throw the Ukrainians under the bus. I think there's another version of that's not quite as violent, that says, okay, slowly, the level of violence is going to go down, right? But if you're Russia, you're not going to negotiate a peace treaty. You're not going to surrender territory in return for peace. What you're going to do is simply preserve your fighting capacity and wait until the circumstances get better. I mean, that's what they did from 2014 to 2022, right? That war in eastern Ukraine completely bogged down for them, but they didn't seriously negotiate a peace. I mean, there was the Minsk agreements. I don't take the Minsk agreements too seriously. But they didn't really try to achieve a solution as much as they said, we can wait you out. And so we might see the Russians just kind of bring down the level of violence for 6 years, 10 years, 20 years. And then off they go again. Let me just give you one historical example, which is not from a long time ago. Right after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia got troops into Moldova and Georgia. Their troops are still in both of those countries. And in the case of Georgia, they were there from 1992, right, to 2008. And finally in 2008, there was a big, flash up again of war. Mm. So the Russians, I think they have been patient, but I think they also have a basic rule of their own, which is once you get yourself in territory, you don't leave. You don't leave.
That makes sense to me. That there's not going to be
any.
Why
would they?
Yeah.
It's funny. Henry Kissinger a few months ago was in Davos, and he's like 99 years old or something, but apparently still a sharp guy. When he was talking about Ukraine will have to be satisfied with going back to the pre-February 24th boundaries. Basically, meaning Ukraine's going to have to accept that it's going to lose Crimea and lose that chunk of Donbass. And people got very mad at him for giving Ukrainian territory away. But my question is, why would Russia ever agree to that? Mm-hmm. Right? So the great realist, Kissinger, turns out to be, I think, idealistic on the border of delusional about why Russia would ever accept a deal that the Ukrainians think is terrible. Mm-hmm. That's how far apart the sides are. Mm-hmm.
And so your analysis is Russia is going to wait this out. But one point here is, like, even the invasion itself wasn't anticipated because Russia has been playing this long game. And it seemed to be that Putin all of a sudden saw some element of time there, or that time was not on his side anymore, and he had to take action, right? And I guess the broader question here is, like, what is Putin's health? What is his long-term plan? Does he have... Like if he sees he only has 5-10 years left, or who knows what he sees, but does he really have the time to just wait this out in that capacity? Whereas he might have done that in the past.
That's an excellent point, and again, it depends very much on both Putin's sense of his own longevity, which we know nothing about, except speculation. I don't even want to call it rumors. It's not even got as much information as a rumor. Mm-hmm. But also his sense of what he considers like the minimum he needs to achieve to kind of, check the box and say, I've established my place in history. Mm-hmm. I don't know. My guess is if he could get another couple hundred miles west, if he could get Odessa, and get all of the Ukrainian Black Sea coast, I don't think he would feel he necessarily needs to get the rest of Ukraine. I'm not sure he needs to get Kiev. And this will connect us to our friend, Mr. Dugin, and his unfortunately deceased daughter, Ms. Dugina, in terms of what the aspirations of some of these theorists are. But you're right in the sense of if he was in a hurry enough to attack, might he still be in a hurry? Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to tell, right? There's been speculation rampant about Putin's state of mind and his health for decades, and we still don't have much clarity around this. We just know that he's become more and more isolationist as a personal person, and we don't even know where this influence is coming from. But we do know one name that you just brought up that is very, very relevant right now, which is Alexander Dugin, who is a Russian political philosopher and analyst and strategist, who many of Putin's views might be derived from Dugin's philosophy. And one of the reasons of real significance at this point is because Alexander Dugin's daughter, Daria Dugin, who is a Russian journalist, a pro-Russian Russian journalist and political activist, was just assassinated on the outskirts of Moscow in a car bomb. And the Russians are blaming this on the Ukrainians and vowing massive retaliation. So can you speak to this?
Yeah. So first, Dugin. Dugin's been. I have friends. This is not my line of work. You know, sort of the Russian nationalist philosophers. Not really something I study, but I have friends who've been studying these guys since the 90s. I remember friends of mine talking about Dugin back in the 90s, and they were reading his stuff and saying, this guy is really scary, and people in Russia are listening to him. He styles himself a philosopher. He propounds this theory called Eurasianism, which is basically that Russia should be this great multi-ethnic empire. And it needs to expand in order to fulfill its historical destiny. He's been the subject of some very good marketing about, I don't know, must be 10 or 15 years ago now. Somebody wrote an article in which they referred to Dugin as Putin's brain, and that kind of stuck. I think among people who specialize on this stuff, there's some skepticism as to how much influence Dugin really has over Putin as opposed to other people, but he's been very effective at portraying himself as the Putin whisperer. But he's a scary guy. He's basically been laying out essentially fascist imperialist doctrines for 20 years and building a following in Russia. His daughter, Daria, basically has been following the same line. She's a journalist, doesn't exactly feature herself as quite the philosopher that he pretends to be, but they're kind of a team. So they were at this event near Moscow together. Apparently, we don't know exactly whose car it was, but apparently he was originally going to be traveling in that car and then at the last minute switched.
He was the target. He was potentially the target as well.
Everything we can see would lead us to believe that he was the target, not her. You know, there's this famous plane crash that killed Buddy Holly, and there's all these other famous people that came this close to getting on the plane that killed Buddy Holly but didn't. So it was probably meant for him, didn't kill him. So then there's the question of who planted this bomb. The Russians immediately blamed it on Ukraine. I personally am quite skeptical. There was a Russian opposition group based outside of Russia, claimed credit, basically a sort of we're against the war and we did this. I'm skeptical about that too. My best guess is, and I want to stress that I've got no inside information, this looks to me like an internal Russian spat. I'm guessing Dugin got in a fight with the wrong people, and it probably had to do with money. And
when you say the wrong people, are you saying like Putin?
No, I doubt Putin. I think if he got sideways with Putin, he probably would either find the tax police investigating him. I'm guessing somebody who didn't have the ability to have him arrested. I'm talking some probably organized crime group. But I want to stress that I'm speculating. But there's another possibility as well. There's another possibility that Putin was responsible for this, not in the sense that he necessarily wanted to kill Dugin, but that he might be beginning to a campaign to get the Russian people ready for the fact that he needs more soldiers. So if you go all the way back to 1999, before he comes to power, right, there were these bunch of apartment-built bombings around Russia. And there's a lot of evidence at the time and afterwards that these, in fact, were done by the FSB.
At Putin's direction specifically, to bring him to power.
And it was this violence and then the response to the violence that Putin rode to power. So it's not, I have to say, again, we're absolutely speculating. But if I say which scenario looks most likely to me, it's either Dugin got an argument with somebody who didn't like him and they decided to blow him up, or it's that Putin or people around Putin have decided it's time to make it look like the war, it's time to provide some evidence that the Ukrainians are really terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
Put it that way.
I mean, yeah, it could be sort of used as this rally around our troops and around the country, false flag operation, so to speak, right? Yeah. And this is these are the words from the Ukrainian government. Their presidential advisor states, "We are not a criminal state like the Russian Federation, much less a terrorist one." They are denying involvement. Dugin's father, Alexander Dugin, called the killing of his daughter a terrorist act executed by the Nazi Ukrainian regime. And so these are the two sides. And you bring up a really good point. It could be an internal thing, because do the Ukrainians even have the capacity to carry out an act like this? And what are they gaining from carrying out this assassination?
I think it would be nuts for the Ukrainians to start blowing up things in Russia that are not absolutely military targets for exactly the reasons we're talking about. The last thing the Ukrainians want to do is get the Russian people motivated in this war. And they're aware of that. They also, I think, do have this sense of, we're not going to do the stuff that they do. So, they had some pretty daring attacks in say, Crimea last week, or over the last couple of weeks. They did not attack the beaches where the Russians, and they could have, right? They could have said, we're going to bring this home to Russian civilians by bombing the beaches in Crimea. They didn't bomb the beaches. They bombed a military airstrip 10 miles away. So, I mean, you never know, of course, but the other thing that makes me skeptical of the story that it was the Ukrainians was it was less than 24 hours after the attack that the Russians had miraculously solved the crime and had all this evidence. That is either like an incredibly quick response, right? Or they had it all ready to go. Including with, photographs of a license plate of a Mini Cooper and all this kind of stuff.
This is right out of the Russian playbook that they've been utilizing for so long. And look, we're not drawing conclusions here because we can't say at all. But this does have the hallmarks of some sort of Russian act, and we don't know. It very well could have been Ukrainian, but at the same time, it's hard to say. And Ukraine is denying.
And it could have been this Russian opposition group.
Yeah, that's another thing. Yeah.
So, I will say that at the time the war started, right, there were Ukrainian refugees were going a lot of different directions. Most of them went west. A few of them did go into Russia, and you would presume that if the Ukrainian secret services had their act together, they would have infiltrated some people into Russia. Is this what they would have done with them? I can't imagine. Can't imagine.
Do you think Ukrainian armed forces are operating, or at least intelligence forces are operating across the border in Russia as we speak?
I am guessing that there is a very small number of people, who have been stationed there, maybe under different kind of guises, and are probably doing things like reporting on troop movements. But I don't think we've seen very much evidence yet that they have the ability to carry out operations. In Crimea, yes. In Russia proper, I'm guessing they have some capacity. But even if you had people in Russia, how would you get weapons to them? How would you get explosives to them at this point? It would be really challenging. So, the Russians had spent 20-something, 30 years, and they had the entire legacy of the Soviet KGB in Ukraine to sort of get set up for this kind of stuff. The Ukrainians really haven't had the same thing.
Can you speak a little bit? I mean, the Biden administration has given a lot of resources, money. There's potential weaponry coming from the West as well. Speak a little bit about the intelligence resources, and how much do you think is being shared with Ukrainians? How much support is being given? Is there actual agents involved, do you think, on the ground in Ukraine that are on the U.S. side, or is it all through just communication channels?
That's a good question. I think there are very few, if any, Americans sort of embedded with Ukrainian forces. Just because the consequences, if they were to be captured, would be pretty dramatic. There are all kinds of course, people from around the world who've gone and volunteered, and some of them are American, and some of them are American ex-military. But I don't think that's necessary. I think what's happening is that the United States, or maybe from NATO bases, closer by, are providing information to the Ukrainians. a lot of, satellite stuff, but also whatever we might be getting from our human intelligence in Russia. There are limits. I think there's a presumption by the American intelligence community that the Ukrainian, folks are penetrated by Russians. And so the United States isn't going to give anything to Ukraine that would compromise, what do they call this, sources and methods, right? Because the assumption is the Russians will get their hands on. But from what we can tell, a lot of our capacity, where are Russian headquarters based, right? Where are the troops moving and so on? That information is being shared.
Mm-hmm. So like we said, at the 6-month mark, you wrote the book Ukraine and Russia from Civilized Divorce to Uncivil War. After the war happened, I'm sure there was a lot of updates to be made to that book. I think you were in the process of sending in the manuscript for your new edition. Tell us a little bit about what you have expanded upon in this book.
Okay. Be careful what you get me talking about. The book, the revised manuscript is due September 1st. I will send it off next week. I'm very excited and it's basically done. Basically the new version does 3 things that the old one didn't. One is it covers what happened since the time of the Minsk II agreement in 2015, sort of 2015 up through 2021. That's a new chapter.
Mm-hmm.
There's another new chapter really basically covering just what's happened in 2022. And then there's a new conclusion, which both sort of looks back and says, okay, now from 2022, looking back, how do we explain how all of this happened? Because the book itself, for people who don't know, I should say this, the book starts in 1989, 1990. And I argue, and I believe this very strongly, that to understand this conflict, you have to go back then because this conflict began with the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This was not caused by NATO expansion. NATO expansion might have made it worse. It was not caused by Vladimir Putin even, who definitely made it worse. It was there from the beginning. So a new chapter showing, and this really becomes a key chapter because the question is, the Russians seem to be pretty happy with Minsk in 2015, right? 2022, they attack. What happens between 2015 and, say, the end of 2021 to get Putin to the point where he's like, this isn't working for me anymore?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what the one chapter covers. Then the next chapter sort of covers the war and the decision itself. And then the conclusion sort of considers. And the big thing I grapple with in conclusion, and to be honest, I'm still grappling with this, is when we were just talking about the war in 2014, you could explain it with some sort of logic, it seems to me. And as you've already hinted in the questions you've asked today, there's this other explanation that we now have to take more seriously about 2022, which is this idea that sort of it's all about Putin and what's going on inside his head.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to address those 2 different kinds of explanations.
Mm-hmm.
It's big structural forces in history, or it's one crazy guy who happens to be in charge of a big country.
Mm-hmm. And it could be both. Right.
And it could, and that I think is really important. As political scientists, we always want the simplest, social scientists want simple unicausal explanations.
Yeah.
And
that's not always the case though. And there's a lot of complexity.
When I wrote this book, I realized I'm as much of an historian as I am a political scientist.
Well, I mean, there's, I'm sure a lot of insights. Anybody who wants to learn more about the, the historical aspects of this conflict, the beginnings of this, the causal nature, this book is obviously going to be very, very insightful. When is the new edition coming out?
I'm guessing it'll be just about the first of the year.
Okay, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes at the bottom.
It's got to, there's a whole lot of production yet to happen. I have to say, though, the first edition, Cambridge University Press, they're very efficient. And so hopefully things will move quickly.
All right. That's great to hear. So, once again, as the largest war in Europe since World War II drags on at the 6-month mark, as you foresee it, there is still a lot more to come, unfortunately, with this conflict. It is, we're nowhere near the end.
Yep.
And
I'll just say, Sirish, you mentioned a little bit about U.S. support. The United States just enacted another aid package this past week. And what's interesting about this aid package is this is an aid package for the long term, not just in the size of it, but it's much more about. So that's actually giving contracts to American defense firms to build weaponry. So it's really shifting from immediately we got to get weapons to Ukraine to we've got to build a long-term capacity to supply Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that's absolutely the right thing to do, but it's very sobering.
Mm-hmm. Does any of that change with the change of administration?
Depends on who the next administration is.
I mean, that's what I'm wondering. If you
No, let me be quite serious. Again, I think there is a great deal of consensus in between Republicans and Democrats on this. But one of the important exceptions to that is a guy called Donald Trump, who we know loves Putin and doesn't seem to have much use for NATO and so on. So I think he's very much a wild card. I mean, that would be the best thing that could happen to Russia, would be Trump gets elected president. There's one other person that a lot's being said about, and that's a guy called DeSantis from Florida. And I don't have a sense yet of where he is on this. And the one thing I will say about all these politicians is they have very, very strong principles until their voters think otherwise. And then they bail fast, right? So if the American people really turn against this war, the Congress will as well.
Mm-hmm. And regardless if Trump gets reelected or not, he still has a major influence in a large part of America, and that swings decision making. And not only does it swing decision making, the conversations that are had online, on Twitter, on the public, on Fox News, everything like that. And I'm sure this is Putin's wet dream is more interference in our elections for Trump to get elected. We have to be very wary of some of these things that are happening. I'm sure there's all sorts of operations that the Russians are pulling right now for the U.S. to change our minds.
I will say this is. That's my phone.
It's all good. Yeah.
This is one way in which I think we may not have given this enough attention. In terms of the so-called information war, Russia has really lost immense ground. A couple of years ago, people either kind of were impressed by Putin or didn't really much care. And nobody was really very sympathetic about Ukraine. The Ukrainians that now look like heroes. You still see Ukrainian flags flying around, and just a lot of support for Ukraine that didn't exist a year ago. And unless you're a pretty hardcore populist right wing or authoritarian, you can't really have too much nice to say about Putin and Russia at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to be pretty hard. People will be able to make the case, it's not our business, but but it's going to be very hard to seem like you're defending Vladimir Putin in Russia right now, because too many atrocities, too many civilian bombings, too much. I mean, and the hostility of the rhetoric against the West and against the United States is too strong at this point. So in that important information space, the Russians have dug themselves a pretty deep hole, I think.
And as you said, it seems to be the one issue for the most part that both sides of the aisle can come together on, which is a good sign. So we'll continue tracking this. Thank you so much, Paul, for your insights as always, and we will continue these conversations. And thank you. I'll talk next time.
Sounds great.
Yeah.